So our next step on the quest to deciding how old our recording is going to sound or what kind of vibe we're trying to capture is whether we're recording in mono or stereo. And whether we're recording in mono or stereo, I typically have a microphone up for a mono mic for any sort of vibe that I would try and capture for, say, a B section or an intro. There's typically something else up there. Plus, this can bring a great general center sound to your kit if you use it properly. So we're going to start with the 4038. Tends to be a smokier microphone. It takes high-end EQ very, very well, but it's not the brightest. The D19 is the typical classic Beatles microphone. This is actually a very bright microphone, but it's got great low end as well, and it sounds amazing. The D190 is probably the biggest sleeper out of all of the microphones that are on the table currently. This microphone can be had very, very inexpensively, and it's loved by people like Kevin from Tame Impala, as well as George Martin had a ton of these at Air Studios. In London and England, what you got to realize is that the 57 wasn't as common of a microphone as it was over here in America. So in America, it got used in almost every major recording studio had a pile of 57s, and they would tend to put them on tons of different things: snare drums, tom-tom drums, the piano sometimes, electric guitars. Well, in London, it seems that the AKG microphones found favor in the same sort of places because they were available. This microphone, though, I have to say, is a lot brighter than a 57. It's a great sounding microphone, and this microphone can be had for a fraction of the cost while, sounding pretty indistinguishable to my ears. These two microphones are interesting. They are Shure ribbon microphones, and they're older. This is the 315, and this is the 300. The 300 seems to be a classier version of the 315. I will say that this is a more full-bodied microphone, and it sounds nicer than this microphone. This microphone sounds like a trash can lid on a drum set. It is the sound of indie rock in my mind. If someone's like, oh, let me make this drum sound indie and shitty, this is the vibe to go for. Buy a 315. And I actually learned about that microphone here in Omaha from people who were making records in their houses. And I've used it in that same capacity ever since. The 47 can be used in hundreds of different situations when it comes to a mono overhead microphone. It can be used by itself, and you can get some very early sounding recordings, the way that people would record in the, early 50s and stuff like that on Elvis records. This was common to just throw one of those guys up. The 67, on the other hand, is a little bit brighter, a little bit zingier, a little bit punchier, but with a nice deadened drum sound. This is a very, very classic sound of the 60s and 70s when it comes to soul sound records. Motown recorded with this microphone, and these are, of course, our DIY versions that we've made ourselves. But this version, or this microphone, was used on all of the Motown hits, and it sounds amazing. The Beyer M160 is a very, very classic microphone, and I heard originally about this microphone being used as an overhead on When the Levee Breaks, and it's been used on tons and tons of great 70s, 80s, 90s records. I believe it was around at the late 60s, but only the very late 60s, and it is a great sounding microphone. It is very, very bright, very detailed, but it has great mid-range and great low end. And there's an awesome video of Eric Valentine using this microphone to capture a whole drum set. He wanted to get a one mic drum sound, and this is the microphone that he decided and chose. And he's not wrong, because the way that it reproduces low end, when placed properly and on its own, can be very, very true to a source signal. The C414 is going to be the brightest out of all of these microphones that I'll typically use for a mono overhead. There's things missing from this list. You can really use any drum mic or any microphone really as a drum overhead. U87s, you could use 451s for a mono overhead instead of stereo overheads. But for me personally, this is what I tend to rely on. And the 450 or the C414 is going to be the brightest choice. And this will be one of those things where, you know, I tend to use this if I'm going to use it in a mono situation with other microphones very, very low in the mix, just because of how much attention it can draw to itself. But if I'm going to use it on its own, this is because I want, you know, to use as little EQ as possible. I want everything to be crisp, clear, and sounding great right off the bat. So this tends to be, if I'm going for, you know, a modern but mono drum sound that comes together very quickly, my number one choice.